Welcome to Lenten Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Well, Ralph and Judy, welcome to our first Lenten conversation. I'm so glad you guys could join me. And throughout this devotional series, we are going to be talking about the things that Jesus said from the cross. And today we're exploring one of the shortest things Jesus says from the cross, which is, I thirst, or in some translations, I'm thirsty, I am thirsty. Jesus says all of these profound things from the cross, but this one seems so mundane and in a lot of ways so ordinary, dare I say so human. It almost makes me wonder why the writer of the Gospel of John chose to include it at all. I mean, I think it's safe to say that not every word Jesus spoke was recorded or put in the Gospels. So why include this one? It's almost as if someone is filming this incredible movie and then the actor playing Jesus calls, "Cut, I need some water." And the producers decide to include this off-camera moment in the final film. Why did this gospel writer include this very candid moment, do you think? Why is it so important for us to be reminded of Jesus' humanity on the cross?
I don't think there's a time or a person that could say that they've never been thirsty. Because it is such a daily need and such an important thing for us to survive. I think it just makes him so much more human and real to us.
Relatable. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I can improve on that answer. I feel the same way. Although I do remember the famous painting by Grunewald. I don't know if you've ever seen that painting. Grunewald was a German painter, and he painted probably the most realistic picture of Jesus on the cross that I have ever seen. Mm-hmm. And I invite you to look it up. You can find it on the internet. But I mean, you can see all of the piercings that he suffered, from the whips and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And well, the way Grunewald paints it is that the figure is so heavy, Jesus's body is so heavy that it actually bends the crossbar of the cross. And of course, there are figures standing beside it, which there's a little anachronism there because he has John the Baptist standing there pointing with his index finger at Jesus, saying the words, he must increase and I must decrease. So, but it's a beautiful painting. Of course, there are other paintings of Jesus on the cross, like Dali's famous one. You've probably seen that one, which is really from above, looking down on Jesus. But we really get the sense of his humanity, which is so encouraging, I think, to realize.
So we get the sense of his humanity, and I'm hearing from you, Judy, that the I thirst just makes him relatable. He's human. And I'm hearing from you, Ralph, that this also makes his pain real. The more human and just like us he is, the more we understand the immense pain of the cross.
His sufferings, absolutely, yeah.
Well, tell me about an experience you've had with extreme thirst. What's that like? What was that like for you?
But I tend to not allow myself to feel things like hunger and thirst. But one of my most vivid memories and enjoyable ones is a song that's sung by a group called Sons of the Pioneers. It's about cool water. Have you ever heard that song? Mm-hmm. All day I face the barren waste without the taste of water, cool, clear water. And it's sung in such a way that you just feel like you're part of that group and you're thirsting. And he goes on to say, old Dan and I, with throats run dry, call for cool, clear water. Beautiful song.
Oh, it sounds like it.
So whenever I hear that, my throat gets a little parched.
So tell me, Ralph, tell me more about I don't allow myself to feel hunger or thirst. Tell me about what you mean by that.
Or I don't not allow myself. I just don't pay attention to it, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't bother with it.
Okay. Judy, have you ever had an experience?
In my situation, yes. As many of you know, I taught in Africa, and it was in Malawi, Africa, and it was in the summer, which was their winter, but it was still in the high 70s, low 80s. And we, by our doctors, were advised not to drink their water. So we had to make certain we had water with us all the time. And we had just finished teaching at one particular conference, and we had 1 liter per person left. We were allowed 1 liter of bottled water a day. And we got in the van, and we had a 4-hour trip in front of us to go to our next teaching session, because we teach for a week. And so that's fine. We got up that morning, you took your medicine, blah, 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 drank some of your water, and you kept looking, thinking how much you could drink at a time. Our van broke down an hour away from where we were, 3 hours away from where we could go. And we went to this mud hut, which was a store, and all they had to give us was twine. We had a broken belt on some part of the car. I don't remember. They opened the engine and said, "Oh, look, the belt's broken." So I don't know what it was on. But anyway, the belt was broken. All they had was twine, and the twine wouldn't work. One of the gentlemen took their belts off, and we tried to carve it and cut it with our little crafty round scissors to make it work, and we couldn't get it to work. And here we are out in the land of nowhere, no shade tree, and our bottle of water, each one of us. And it took us about another hour before we decided we had to call for help. The place we had to call to get help was that spot 3 hours away. So we had to wait for them to find a vehicle that would hold, there were 6 of us, that would hold 6 of us and bring us in that heat and come and pick us up. Thank goodness they were wise enough to bring water with them. But those next 3 hours, we would keep looking at that bottle of water, because even though we were thirsty, we were afraid to drink it, because we didn't know, there was a chance their vehicle could have broken down. The good news of the story was they did get us home. We had to ride in the paddy wagon. That's the only thing the guy could find. He was a retired policeman, and he'd gone to the police department. So that's a good thing. And it was the only time I've ever been in one. But we all truly felt that thirst that day and wondered when would be our next time to drink.
Thank you for sharing.
What a good story. Beautiful.
And it's true.
Yeah.
Well, my story is not nearly as adventurous as that. I had my kind of horror wisdom tooth story, but I had my wisdom teeth out right before my senior year of high school, and ended up developing an obstructing ulcer from some of the pain meds that they put me on after I had my wisdom teeth out. And it was an obstructing ulcer right in my small intestine. So I literally could not swallow anything down. And it took them a long time to figure out what was going on with me. And I remember we had gone to the ER and they sent me home, not knowing what was going on at first. And I remember sucking on ice cubes, just trying to get any little bit of water. I was so thirsty, and my body was starting to feel really, weak from not having food or water. And not even that was working. And I just remember just the panic of being that thirsty. And then of course, eventually they admitted me to the hospital and put an IV in my arm, and my body got the fluids it needed. But that was just a horrible feeling to not be able to take in this basic need, water.
You both had very harrowing experiences.
Well, now John chapter 19, verse 28 is where we find these words. And it says, Jesus said this in order to fulfill the scripture. What scripture do we think that is referring to?
Well, it's interesting that that all four of the Gospels do record the fact that the people who were around Jesus, the guards and everything, tried to give him vinegar. And but John's Gospel is the only one that said where Jesus says, "I thirst." But he does this in order to, in a sense, provoke the extension of the vinegar to him.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a passage in the Psalms, in Psalm 22 and 69, both have similar verses, and both are psalms that are cries for a deliverance from sufferings.
Okay, so
And
Psalm 62, Psalm
Psalm 22 and Psalm
69.
69, yeah.
Yeah, Psalm 69, verse 21, and then Psalm 22, verse 15. That's what
Yeah.
we think this is referring to. And you were saying again, Ralph, that those are Psalms of what?
Psalms of their prayers for deliverance. The psalmist, she or he, is crying out to God for deliverance from sufferings, many different kinds of sufferings. And in Psalm 69, the saying is, the statement is that for food they gave me poison, and for drink they gave me vinegar.
Okay.
That's what happens in Jesus's situation. They give him vinegar.
So that's how this is maybe fulfilling the scriptures.
Yeah.
The thing I found amazing when I was looking through it on the scripture, that the gall that they gave, that some say it's poppy and some says it's poison. And then I looked it up, and it takes like within 30 minutes after you have it is when they usually die. And I found that was interesting because it could have been a merciful thing to be doing. That guard maybe had watched this man suffer so long, and he just wanted to help him get it over with. And I had never thought of it that way before. And then the vinegar, when I read that part of I thirst, there's so many different kinds of vinegar. So I went researching and all the different kinds, and the ones the strongest and the ones the weakest. And the insult it was to give a Jewish individual that type of wine, that was, in that day and age, the culture, that would have been just the most insulting thing to do. So I'm looking at the one hand where it's saying that maybe he was being merciful and giving him the gall or the hemlock or whatever, if you want to interpret them by different scenarios. And yet, on the other hand, the insult it was by giving him that wine vinegar.
And why was that insulting? I haven't read that before. Can you tell us more about that?
It was unpalatable to the Jewish people, and they would have never drank that kind of wine. So that was a type of wine that was, or a vinegar that was used by the lower people, and it was very common to be used upon a cross for a soldier. That was what they used for them. But because Jesus being a Jew, that was considered a more indignant way to treat him, even more than just us thinking about regular vinegar. It's the fact that it was the wine vinegar, which was stronger and was just I don't want to use the word unacceptable, just less appropriate.
Okay.
Or definitely an insult. At least that was according to a couple of the vinegar research sites I looked at.
Okay.
Well, that idea goes along with the psalmist, which talks about the fact that he was, or she was being insulted by his enemies or her enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Psalms that this might be referencing, that this might be fulfilling, are talking about being insulted by an enemy. And so, yeah, for whatever reason, this seems from your research, Judy, to have been an insult and a drink for Gentiles, not for the Jews. And here they're offering it to him. It's the only thing they're offering him.
Well, they almost sound like the crucifixion. I mean, some of them, some of the words, and Isaiah as well. When you read those passages, it sounds like just word for word what happened in the crucifixion of Jesus and the sufferings that he experienced.
I think the saying goes, it's all in hindsight, right? I mean, hindsight's 2020.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
and so
Right.
we're looking at it through the lens of the way the gospel writers write about the crucifixion, and it sounds like it's just echoing so
It does. Yeah.
perfectly these psalms and certainly Isaiah's suffering servant.
Mhm.
And yet we don't know, is that just the way the gospel writers wrote about the crucifixion to intentionally make it sound like an echo? You know, it's hard to sometimes suss out what's what there. And yet we definitely hear echoes of some of these Hebrew scriptures, particularly these Psalms, these, you know, the songs would have been on string instruments, songs
Yes.
that people sung. And so kind of like our hymns, like they would have been stuck in their head, right?
Yes.
True. Yes. Mhm.
Yeah. Kind of like if if someone said a couple words of Amazing Grace, we would automatically hear the rest of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happens here is Jesus says, "I thirst," and people are hearing echoes of these songs that they knew really well.
And just like the psalmist, Jesus is suffering because of his devotion to God.
Mm,
The psalmist says in verse 9, it is zeal for thy house, for your house, that has consumed me. The insults of those who insult you, have fallen on me. So that's kind of what it's a fulfillment in a sense of that psalm, Jesus' sufferings and the words that we see from the cross from him
mm,
echo that. An interesting thing about that, the idea that where he talks about the zeal for your house consuming me, that's also mentioned in the second chapter of the Gospel of John, when Jesus cleanses the temple. And the disciples said later they recalled that verse about, the zeal for God's house. And that was definitely what Jesus was exemplifying when he was cleansing the temple. But it was Jesus's zeal for God's house, for God's righteousness, that ended up in his being persecuted, crucified, insulted, and ending up on the cross.
mm. I think about sometimes when we don't have words to put our own prayers into words, we go looking for someone else's words. And I think, you know, what's amazing about this is that the the gospel writers kind of um, seem to go back and say, okay, here's what we saw and experienced and what we heard from Jesus on the cross. Um, what famous prayers or songs, hymns does this remind me of? And went back to these psalms and really connected the dots for us. You know, this is the kind of emotion that we were hearing from the cross and where it was coming from. Well, why is Psalm 69 a significant thing for Jesus to communicate from the cross?
I think it's so everyone knows that he knew he was going as planned. It wasn't just his plan, it was God's plan. And it was going exactly the way it was supposed to. And he knew that. And he was telling everyone, this is the way it's supposed to be.
Thank you for that, Judy. Yeah. Um, Here's a situation where most people would feel powerless and where Jesus' disciples certainly probably felt like, um, wow, we thought that that Jesus, that God was powerful. And then here um, we see the person we thought was our savior up on the cross and feeling so helpless and so out of control. And then Jesus speaks these really comforting words. Um, basically taking back that power from the oppressors and handing it back to God and saying, no, God's still got this. This is how it was supposed to happen.
And ultimately, I think it becomes a sign not only for the crucifixion, but also for the resurrection, ultimately of God's deliverance, because that's what the psalmist was praying for deliverance. And in fact, Jesus even said something about that in the garden when he was asking that the cup pass from him, but that not his will, but God's will be done. So I think referring to Psalm 69 and also to the idea that he was suffering because of his passion or zeal for God's, for cleansing God's house, for righting the way to God's deliverance and for God's ultimate bringing the world to the right place. That's kind of what I see it as a sign of that.
Yeah, so Jesus needed to frame what was happening for his followers, and he does that from the cross. We know that at least in some of the other gospel accounts, not just John, that week leading up to Jesus' death seems to have been a week when Jesus really went toe to toe with the authorities in Jerusalem, whether they be Roman or the temple authorities. He really went to toe and was shaking things up and challenging what he perceived as injustices. And he's going to claim from the cross through this reference to Psalm 69, this is what it was all about. This is why this is happening, because basically I tried to challenge some of the injustices and the evil systems of the world. And this is what is happening now. Yeah. Well, being thirsty and asking for a drink is actually a really significant theme in the scriptures. Tell me about some of the stories. We'll start with the Hebrew scriptures. Tell me about some of the stories in the Hebrew scriptures that talk about being thirsty or asking for a drink. You remember any?
Well, of course, the Exodus and Moses' people suffered great thirst. Mm-hmm. That's a very common one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have that story of them at one point, very shortly after leaving Egypt, saying to Moses, basically, it'd be better for us to go back and be slaves because they're so hungry and thirsty. And
yes,
Moses comes and kind of falls before God and says, please help, these people are thirsty. And God says, go strike that rock. And he does. With that same staff that he parted the water, he strikes the rock and water comes out of the rock, or at least that's how the story goes. And the people are, their thirst is quenched by God out there in the wilderness.
So, but anyway, he gave the water for deliverance in that case. And water has been a symbol for deliverance, or other symbols too. For instance, that wonderful story of Rebecca in Genesis 24, where the servant of Abraham goes to Haran to find a wife for Isaac, and ends up getting Rebecca because she gives water from the well to water the camels.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? He has this sense of she's someone of good character because she's someone who offers water to his camels.
Yeah.
What about Hagar and Ishmael? Do you remember that story?
Yeah, that's an interesting one too. Hagar is fleeing. Well, she's been thrown out of the house by Sarah, who is jealous, and the child is very small and about to die of thirst, and God directs her to a place where she can get water for the child, for Ishmael. Beautiful story too.
Yeah, Hagar is this heartbreaking story of, Sarah and Abraham can't have a child, and so she says, have a child with our maid, essentially, and so he has a child with their maid, but then Sarah ends up having a child, and that sort of displaces Hagar and her child, and they end up getting kicked out, and it's there in the wilderness. She's ready to just, she thinks her child's just going to die. She lays her child over by a tree, because she's having such a hard time bearing it. And then God ends up providing water.
And then, of course, Ishmael becomes the father of a great people as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move on to thirst in the Gospels. John in particular talks a lot about water and thirst and being given a drink. What do the Gospels say about thirst?
Well, of course, there's that wonderful story of the marriage feast in Canaan, where Jesus turns the water into wine. That's certainly a famous one.
Yeah, John's Gospel begins, Jesus' whole ministry begins at this wedding feast where the drink has run out, the wine has run out, and everyone's thirsty. And we know that in biblical times, at least from what I've read, most people didn't drink water because it could be contaminated. They often would drink kind of alcohol that was low alcohol content, but enough to kind of make it safe to drink. And so Jesus ends up turning the water into wine at his mother's beckoning. He's not ready.
And it's not cheap wine either.
Right. And it's the best wine that they've served all night. Yeah.
Right.
What's another story from the Gospels, or particularly the Gospel of John?
We have the one with the Samaritan woman who was
Yes.
getting water from the well. And when Jesus approached her and asked for water, she was questioning why he would ask her for water. Again, that we're back to that culture and what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate. But at the same time, it teaches us that he didn't see any differences of the people. He talked to everyone and treated all the same.
And there's such a, just asking her for water was so countercultural that it was this enormous inclusive statement to ask her for water.
Yes.
How did that conversation go between the Samaritan woman and Jesus?
Okay, if I remember right, she was at the water and getting it, and he came up and he asked if he could have a drink. Jesus and she had this short exchange, but it was enough that she knew that there was something different about this man.
Well, in fact, she said, how is it that you, a Jew, asks me, a Samaritan, for something to drink? Mm-hmm. You don't even have anything to draw water with, she says to him. Of course, he didn't. That's why he asked for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then they have this whole exchange, and he seems to know all these details about her life, and she's just amazed. And I think particularly amazed, she's had a series of husbands, and she says the man she lives with now is not her husband, which would have been quite taboo in those times. And she's amazed that Jesus knows all of this about her, and yet still asks her for a drink of water. And Jesus ends
up offering her water.
Right. He ends up offering her living water, right?
Yeah.
As if only you knew, you would be asking me for water, right?
Right.
Yeah. What else is in the Gospels about thirst and water?
Well, there's that wonderful passage in the Beatitudes where Jesus says that blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Beautiful passage.
Yeah, so Jesus talks about hungering and thirsting for God. And so that basic need, that basic way our body works, Jesus is kind of saying that's how it works in our relationship with God too, that we have this basic need for God and we hunger and thirst for God. So between the Hebrew stories and these sayings and prophecies, these words that invoke so much, and then also the gospel sayings and stories and what they evoke, these two simple words, I thirst, are actually rich with meaning. And it's definitely not what meets the eye at first sight. We sometimes laugh and say that we entered this pandemic time in the middle of Lent, and it feels like we never left the season of Lent, that this entire pandemic, all of us have been out in the wilderness in solitude, being tested just as Jesus was before his ministry. And all of us have been on this journey to the cross. During this wilderness time, many of us have been so thirsty for life in community. We've been thirsty for physical closeness and hugs and all that basic relationship, social stuff that it turns out we humans need and crave when it's absent. And it's not really unlike our need and our craving for water to survive. What good news do these two words of Jesus on the cross, I thirst, what good news do they communicate to those of us who feel so thirsty right now?
Well, I think it's just like when Jesus was on the cross, God was with him.
Mm.
We're lonely, we're discouraged right now, we're pandemic fatigued, but God's walking beside us. He's right there with us. And we've got to trust him and keep our faith in him, and we're going to get through this.
So you hear in it, God was with Jesus and God is with us, even when we're thirsting, suffering. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the beauty of this passage about Jesus thirsting. We realize from this that he knew we thirst, and he knows what we thirst for. And when he's in our hearts, we can be refreshed.
Yeah, that's one of the, just powerful truths about Jesus and about believing that God was with us in this person, Jesus, that God knows what our suffering and our need feels like. There's something so comforting in knowing that our God knows what that feels like, isn't there?
Exactly.
I can't tell you the number of times in the food pantry we've run out of a particular item, and it's a pretty important staple. Maybe one day it was bread, and one day it was spaghetti sauce, and these are important things to our families. And we'd look at each other and we'd say, well, that was the last can. And within 5 minutes, somebody'd be at the donation table with a donation door with a case of spaghetti sauce or 2 boxes of bread. It has repeatedly been done.
And I think the other remarkable thing is that, here when Jesus was on the cross, I mean, talk about facing your mortality, and yet he still had hope, especially that reference to Psalm 69. It seems like he very much had faith that this was all going to be used by God and was a part of what God was doing in the world. And here we all have been really face to face with our own mortality through this time. Someone, I think in fellowship after church today, mentioned having some cold symptoms and worrying that it was coronavirus. And I think a lot of us have done that, right? You start to have even just a little allergy sniffle and you suddenly go, what's going on? Is this something worse? We all have been a lot more aware of our mortality through this time, I think. And there's something so comforting and so hope-filled about seeing Jesus on the cross, literally facing his mortality within hours, right? And yet still claiming that that God's got this, right? That God is doing something here, and that God can take this horrible thing and turn it into something beautiful.
I'll amen that.
Well, thank you both so much for this conversation.